years now. Tonight, we're going to speak a little bit about debt retirement. We're going to be covering various issues regarding debt, both larger term and nuts and bolts. As we go through, if you find that you have a question, feel free to use that chat box that you see in the middle column at the very bottom to type in a question, and Leslie will bring it to my attention so that we can make sure to answer any questions that you have, or feel free to, at the end, we'll have some time there as well. But know that this is meant to be a mutual conversation, not just me doing a monologue. So know that your feedback is always welcome. Now, the Episcopal Church Foundation started by the then presiding bishop in 1948, who wanted there to be a separate 501c3 from the National Church, or the Episcopal Church Center in New York, that was specifically non-ordained led. An organization that would build up the financial and leadership resources. So here is our mission statement at the Episcopal Church Foundation. Our organization's mission is to strengthen the leadership financial capabilities of Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and communities of faith to pursue their mission and ministry. We are specifically created and have continued our mission with Episcopal organizations, not working outside of our own denomination. And we see what we do as ministry, and we hope to empower others to live into theirs. Now, we are going to be talking an awful lot about mission tonight. What we hope to do as we're empowering others towards their mission is to also publish resources. So we have the Episcopal Church Vital Practices, Episcopal Church Foundation Vital Practices. You can find that online. We publish regular blogs and articles. We also have the Vesper Resource Guide. And we have these webinars. And this webinar will be recorded, so if you have friends or neighbors that you want to have joined you, know that they can always go onto our website and download this for free. And the great thing about watching a recorded webinar is you can always stop and go and get some popcorn and then come back. So we'll talk a lot about mission today. The reason why we talk about mission is because it attracts financial support. And if you're clear about your mission, then the funding will follow. So let's get started with a poll. Leslie, would you mind putting up our poll? When you think about debt, if you could make it a little bit bigger, thanks. What is your first thought? I'm going to ask you to select one of these. If we didn't have debt, we'd do more ministry. If I had known we were in this much debt, I would have, and then fill in the blank. What's the big deal? That's not so bad. I wish I didn't feel so nervous, anxious, or angry about debt. Or maybe you feel something else. Please feel free to click on a box. What we will do is we will use your information that you plug in. It'll help me gauge what part of the presentation we need to spend more time on, but it's also kind of an interesting indicator as to what our perception about debt is. I know that I do some continued conversation about debt, and I'm always interested to hear both the organizational perception about debt as well as our own emotional response. This is very helpful. So it looks like in terms of our responses, we're about 50-50. And you can see where the 50-50 is. If I had known we were in this much debt, I would have followed by an action plan and then another response. It'll be interesting to hear what that other would be as we move forward. Leslie, being Vanna, would you take away our poll? Thank you. You're a terrific, Vanna, even if we can't watch. When we think about debt, there's often many different types of images that come to mind. One of these images is often the idea of the burden of debt, or handcuffed into money rather than being able to live into our ministry. Sometimes in some organizations, we place a value statement according to our debt. Perhaps we apply some type of negative or positive feeling around it. Sometimes we begin to get so anxious that we begin to feel almost enslaved by what we owe, rather than being able to live fully into our mission. So Vincent is connecting with this thought and said, when the church has financial debts, it becomes the slave of the lender. And I think that some of our images here sort of connect with your thought. When thinking about debt, I did a little bit of research about what our larger context is, because obviously the church does not function alone, but rather it's influenced by our larger society. And so I wanted to hear what were some of the statistics around debt. Currently, as of January 2014, individual U.S. households, not a community, but a household, a household has an average credit card debt of $15,270. $15,000. Average mortgage debt for a U.S. citizen is $149,925, so almost $150,000 worth of mortgage. Average student loan debt, this is an interesting piece we're going to spend a little bit of time on, $32,258. So in total, American consumers owe about $11 trillion worth of debt, $856 billion in credit card debt, and $1 billion in student loans, an increase of 11% from last year. So as we think about our church, we can understand how debt can play a role as our leaders that are coming to the decision-making table most likely themselves have debt. When thinking about our next generation, the Millennial Generation, which for many of us, we are seeing this Millennial Generation show similar giving characteristics to the greatest generation. When we think about our next generation of leaders, we see that debt will be a given, a necessary function of their finances. Due to this, what was once seen as markers for adulthood are being delayed. So keeping in mind, as you were being formed for being an adult, there were some specific markers of adulthood, steps that you took when perhaps you yourself felt as an adult or perhaps you were perceived as an adult. Some of those markers were going to college, leaving home, becoming independent of your parents or guardian, getting married, buying a home, starting a family. These were the typical markers of adulthood. Now, due to the rising cost of education and the assumed debt load of student loans, these markers of adulthood are being delayed and aren't taking place in necessarily that order. So what we see is that there is a generation that's coming up that is not going to be able to have as large amount of liquid cash available due to debt. And then the folks that are supporting that generation, perhaps, as they have deferred markers of adulthood, probably Generation X or baby boomers, they're going to have a limited amount of liquidity as well because of being able to support the millennial generation. So there's this model of financial stability that is now being impacted. Vincent Santiago asks, are you telling us that being in debt is as expected as needing air to survive? That's very interesting. I would say that as we think about annual giving, as we think about capital campaign giving in our parishes, we're seeing that debt is impacting what people are able to give. And that the millennial generation, in order to receive the same education that other generations received, have to go into debt, most likely, in order to receive that education. So what does that mean in terms of debt for our organizations? Well, what we're seeing is that there are a variety of different reasons why organizations would take on debt. The first being construction for growth. Sometimes organizations will take on debt if they are engaged in a capital improvement process. And so perhaps they have undergone a capital campaign and they're expecting pledges to be paid in between 3 and 5 years, and they want to get started on that capital improvement early. And so in order to do that, they take out a loan knowing that the debt is going to be paid within 3 to 5 years. Where organizations run into trouble is when they take out the debt and they don't have the pledges to back that up. And so the debt that they take on then is taken on through debt servicing and paid out by their operating budget. Other reasons for organizational debt: sudden disaster. That sounds rather ominous, doesn't it? I was working with a parish in Pennsylvania where they were right in the middle of their discernment phase, the first phase, when lo and behold, right in the middle of right on top of the altar, the roof caved in. It was January. And so they couldn't wait to finish the discernment process. They absolutely needed to go into debt in order for folks to stop getting wet on a Sunday morning when they went up for their communion. So this is what they had to do. They took on a loan for a sudden disaster. Now this would, my example would also pair with the next item too, repairs and deferred maintenance. Sometimes there are just issues where you have to take on debt because you have a deferred maintenance issue, whether it be a crack in your foundation, window treatments. These are all different ways in which debt would be a necessity. The next item, though, is a very serious one: operating expenses. Some of the parishes that we work with, in order to keep up with their annual operating expenses, for example, being able to pay for part-time, full-time clergy, take on debt, whether it be borrowing from their endowment or borrowing from an outside lender in order to meet their operating expenses. This is a potentially very dangerous practice, in that if you do not have a plan, which we'll talk about in a little bit, for seeing yourself out of debt, then this can be an expedited way of getting further and further in debt. Finally, capital improvements. Capital improvements fall under a variety of different categories. Capital improvements can be new construction, can be renovation, can be endowment, or can be building up programmatic expenses. Okay, so when thinking about if your church has debt of any size, you might want to ask yourself some questions in order to determine what kind of debt that you are currently in, if it's a debt that is going to be life-giving or if it's a debt that's hindering your overall mission and ministry. The first question is, has the debt had a negative impact in any way on the church's ability to meet current operational needs? Essentially, if your parish has a debt that's being serviced by a debt lender, say a bank of any sort, are your monthly payments not allowing you to pay for other very important pieces of ministry? Has the church been forced to cut back or restrict ministry resources in order to service the debt? Oftentimes, what we see is that with a new building or renovation, if a parish goes into debt to pay for those things and they don't have those pledges in hand, then they end up paying 25, I've even heard 50% of their operating budget to pay for that. And unfortunately, then they have this great building, but the ministry that should be taking place within that building isn't because they're busy paying off their construction costs. So this is a very important question. The next item is, has the debt had a negative impact in any way on the church's ability or willingness to start new or relevant ministries? Oftentimes, I see that could be connecting with some people. Oftentimes, what happens is that when we take on debt, we begin to have anxiety. And that anxiety feeds the larger leadership. We begin to say, oh, we can't live into new ideas. We can't try new things because we're too busy being confined. That is a very important question to ask. What are you not doing because you're currently in debt? Next question. Could the money currently being spent to service a debt obligation be reappropriated to new ministries that inspire and encourage your church, possibly attract new families? So it's almost a chicken and egg principle, isn't it? Like, because we're in debt, we can't, attract new families that would come in and potentially be new donors that would then pay off the debt. It's kind of chasing your tail a bit. Then the next question, which is a really important one, especially for Lent, which is there a mixed message being sent with respect to the manner in which a church is responding to debt and how the is challenged to view and manage personal debt? So we might stand up on a Sunday morning and talk about how important it is for our organization to no longer be in debt, but is your parish talking about its members and how debt is impacting your personal membership? Because as we talked about before, if we know that many of our parishioners are already in debt themselves, the average household having $15,000 worth of credit card debt, then is it hypocritical for us to be talking about our organization not being in debt by not seeing to the needs, the fundamental needs taking place within our parish, perhaps even pastoral need? What are we asking our parish members to give up so that we're no longer in debt when they themselves need help? Let's talk a bit about what can debt do and what can't it do. One of the biggest questions we want to ask is, when is it cheaper to borrow than to use equity? Well, with equity can come an expectation of return of investment that can outpace a bank loan. So one of the items that you always want to check out is, when do you have a lower interest rate that would be better beneficial to you all? Oftentimes churches, because they're in a hurry or because perhaps they don't have all the information they need, they take the first loan that's available, that's made available, rather than taking the time to shop out the loans and looking to see what are the interest rates. Or even once they have a loan, perhaps not considering refinancing. Oftentimes, a local bank would be able to provide you with a loan at a much reduced cost. I was actually speaking to a parish recently where they were able to cut out, well, they thought they were going to have to do a capital campaign, but because they refinanced their loan on their capital improvement, they didn't have to do that any longer. They were able to cut out enough of the money from their operating budget going to debt servicing that they saved themselves from undergoing capital campaign, which was a huge benefit for them. Another interesting item to consider is that debt with a 501c3 is not a tax break. So in our individual finances, we know that oftentimes debt can have positive tax implications. For instance, for my own personal finances, I know that I can write off the tax of my educational debt or I can look at my bank mortgage and receive some deductions for that. However, nonprofits are not able to do that. And so if you're seeing that as a potential positive for taking on debt, that is actually not possible. Finally, thinking about what is the impact of debt on your priorities. So is the debt that you're taking on going to potentially fund new ministry, or is it going to lead you to perhaps being handcuffed, that image of being handcuffed for ministry in the future? Considering that impact is an important one. So before you can identify the impact, you need to define the territory. What is the percentage that you will be paying from your annual operating budget? Is debt going to be considered a fixed cost or a short-term variable? Meaning, is this debt going to be something that you're going to be paying out for the next 10 years, or is this a debt that will be negatively impacting you for 2 to 3 years as you are waiting for your pledges to pay in? This is a great picture that I just love. If you can't read it, I'll read it for you. It says, the dip in sales seems to coincide with the decision to eliminate the sales staff, or what I like to call killing the goose that laid the golden egg. So what happens is sometimes when we go into debt, in order to pay off that debt, or because of the servicing percentage to our regular monthly income, what we end up having happen is that we have to cut what breathes life into our organization. If we believe our mission and vision is exciting and is what people are going to fund, and if we believe that God is calling us to these ministries and we want to invite people out, the thing that we absolutely don't want to have happen is to be so much in debt that we have to cut that mission, and we have to cut that personnel, and we have to cut the resources that are funding our ministries. Because what happens is when we cut those resources and we cut that mission and ministry, then we cut our fundraising potential. So when we think about images of mission then, it's often helpful for us to think about the idea of a plant, that our mission and ministry needs to be watered just like this plant. They need the resources, and so if those resources are going elsewhere, we're not able to grow the way that we need. I'm going to stop here and see, are there any questions or is there any feedback? Feel free to type those in. Here's another, this is a counterpoint to that plant. Oftentimes, as I was describing, when we kill the goose that laid the golden egg, we start taking away resources away from that mission. All right. Jill, I see that you have a question. What percentage of budget should debt take? That's an excellent question. We will be answering that in just a moment. There you go. Ask and you shall receive, Jill. So how much of your annual budget should be for debt service? No more than 25 to 30% of your operating budget. That's the top. Frankly, even at 30%, you'll be seeing your mission and ministry be impacted. But this is the absolute ceiling for that. So before you go into debt, you need to ask that question proactively. How much do we have available for debt service? Are there other questions? Let's keep going then. So what often happens is there is a parish-wide response. We start to say, if we only were blank, we'd be blank enough. We do our best. We just do our best but we're weak in blank. And you can fill that in. But what ends up happening is that similar to our own personal finances, when we start to feel that anxiety, we also start to feel a sense of shame, feeling as though, man, if we only were wiser enough, bigger enough, younger enough, if we were only stronger enough, more spiritual enough, you fill in the blank, we wouldn't have this debt. Is that true? No. And I want to name that that's not the reason why you're in debt. But these are the stories that start to emerge. Or we start talking about ourselves in weakness rather than really talking about the mission and ministry that give life to our organization. And so we begin to have a cycle of shame that comes with having organizational debt. Not all the time, but quite often this is what I see. And what happens then when we have shame? Then we start having a loss of connection. Without that mission and ministry to tie us together, but rather having these negative feelings of anxiety, panic, we begin to feel disconnected as an organization, as a parish. So here are some ideas. Here are some nuts and bolts. Oops, not that many nuts and bolts. There we go. The first idea that you would want to consider before doing, this is the first entry-level nuts and bolts idea, is refinancing. Shop around your interest rate. Like I said, the parish that I recently talked to was able to get a much lower interest rate. Oftentimes what you want to do is look at your bank right around the corner rather than looking at a more corporate bank. Persevere. Don't just take the first couple. Shop around. Look to see what's available. Yeah, another great idea is to consider doing a capital campaign. Capital campaigns are a great way to reestablish what your mission is, to invite people into the process of mission, to get excited, to train up new volunteers, perhaps communicate what is of vital importance, of core value about your parish, and then to create a plan for getting out of debt quickly. We have been able to do a number of debt retirement capital campaigns successfully. This can absolutely be done. And since 2007, we've been seeing more and more capital campaigns focus on debt. Let me tell you how you can really do it. First of all, it's important to make it fun, to make it visible. But most importantly, it's important to make it not about debt. The first thing you need to be able to say is, what would you be doing if you were not in debt? What is it that brings life to your parish? And what is it that you want to do when you no longer have that burden? So oftentimes, organizations, they approach a capital campaign with a not-so-effective plan. Surveys tell us that people give to charitable organizations as an investment of their resources these days, expecting to see results that are tangible, expecting to see results that are good. If we know that from surveys, then the idea of going to a person and saying, please could you consider making a contribution of X amount of dollars to help us pay off our organization's debt, this combination would leave a solicitor feeling uninspired, and it would probably turn off a potential prospect. Because in their mind, they're thinking, well, why should I give if you're already in debt? How do I know you're not going to get in debt again? And, you know, I can't wrap my mind around how my dollar would really impact this large amount of debt anyway. And really, I'm not inspired by this. And so what we have to do is create a capital campaign plan that is inspirational. So what we're able to do then is to start coming up with ideas of, if we were no longer in debt in 2 years. What we'd like to do is start a new outreach ministry in our community. We've seen X, Y, and Z take place, and we have engaged our community, and we've learned that X, Y, and Z is necessary. Or if we didn't have X amount of dollars taken from our monthly budget for debt servicing, then maybe we could afford a full-time clergy. Or if we didn't have X amount of dollars, maybe we could start a new ministry for parents in our parish that desperately need resources for parenting. Creating these wonderful ideas emerging from your parish bottom up, getting excitement around these ideas are a great way to communicate a potential capital campaign. Oftentimes, with conviction and truth, you can begin to refer to a capital campaign as perhaps a bridge fund, meaning that the debt reduction is a bridge to which you can connect building a sound and stable financial future to your organization's mission. Or perhaps maybe calling it an interim fund, meaning that in the interim, you're raising money to pay off the debt that will allow you to live into a solid ground for the future. Or a mission for a ministry fund. You'll see that this is kind of about the wording, but it's much more than wording because you're providing an inspiration, fully alive fund, from death to life. You are communicating a vision that's exciting and inviting people into that vision. We know that a people without a vision perish. So having a vision is very important if you want to pay off debt. As with any type of messaging, you're also going to need to remember the previous sacrifices and gifts that were made. So, for example, working with a parish that perhaps took on a good amount of debt in order to do a capital building, a capital improvement around, say, renovation or a new building, this would be a full opportunity then to remember what has been taken place in the past, thank people on a yearly basis and say, in celebration for what we've done, let's have a remembrance of this new building and then invite people into a fundraising effort. By saying thank you, saying thank you, thank you, thank you, we break the shame. What I want to tell you a bit of a horror story, and the horror story connects to what happens with a successful debt retirement capital campaign as a way for planning. There's a gentleman by the name of Dennis Green, who is the founder and president of Church Development, and he tells the story of a church that he attended in the 1990s. The church believed that debt was not God's will for them and devised a program to eliminate their debt by the year 2000. So this church did everything right. Everything right. They talked about giving. They did a visioning exercise where they determined what they would do if they didn't have debt. They held stewardship education classes, and they educated their leaders about personal debt. And guess what? They followed through. Everybody was engaged. They met their goal of eliminating their debt by the new millennium. Everything went right. But here's where the horror story comes in. The problem is that after the debt elimination campaign, the leadership of the church wanted to build a new building. So they hired a staff member to manage their capital campaign. And unfortunately, this capital campaign manager proceeded to guilt and hound the congregation every week to give to the new building fund. So in addition to these guilt-driven tactics, most of the congregation was even against the new building, given the fact that they had just finished the debt elimination campaign. So the man tells the story and says, we were left wondering what happened to the importance of not being in debt. And it didn't help that this too large building gave the capital campaign manager long-term security. So what the problem is if you engage in a debt elimination campaign, make sure that the debt practices that you talked about wise spending, make sure that this is a long-term change, because what you're talking about is a cultural change, not just a short-term systematic one. In the same way that we talk about with our own personal finances, that if you pay off your credit card, make sure you figure out a way not to get in credit card debt again. You want to apply that reasoning to a debt elimination campaign. Now, another way to pay off debt is estate planning. So estate planning, what that essentially is oftentimes borrowing from your endowment to pay debt service for the short time, with the idea that later you'll go back and perhaps do a capital campaign or some sort of fundraising initiative to pay back your endowment. Now, you would only want to do this if the rate of your endowment that you're receiving is less than the percentage of debt that you are currently in, meaning that perhaps your debt, say, is at 6 to 10% interest rate, and you're only receiving 1 or 2% off of your endowment. Or you're only going to want to do this if you have a plan for replenishment. This can be a very dangerous thing if you do not have a firm plan in place. So I would recommend only using this very cautiously. Bonds. So I have talked to churches where bonds do work. Bonds essentially are when the church, like the government, allows for people to buy bonds with the idea that then they can pay out, the church will then pay out those bonds at a later date. The problem with the bonds is, one, parishioners are assumed to be the main investors. You're not very likely to get community members outside of your parish to buy the bonds. And two, it's a little bit like buying a bond or doing bond. Sorry, it's a little bit like borrowing money from your uncle. So when you start borrowing money from your family, there's always that question of, so does my uncle really want me to pay back the loan? Really, for bonds to work in a church, there's the assumption that the people that are buying the bond aren't actually going to expect you to collect, right? And really, if you're going to go about doing that, then you might as well just engage in a regular fundraising initiative with a major donor ask. This way, they're given the tax break, as well as they're thanked appropriately. And finally, you have clear expectations. You don't have that nebulous relationship. So I would really caution against bonds. I've seen it work a few times if folks in the parish are willing to forgive the debt, but really that doesn't lead to good expectation and communication for the future. So the question is debt a function of mission, or is it a function of sustainability? Do you need debt in order to sustain yourself, or is this debt going to be a necessary part of growth? Make an informed choice before going into debt, looking to see what is the interest rate, what's the impact going to be on your overall operating budget. Finally, if you're going to go into debt, make sure you have a clear plan for how you're going to get out. And if you're going to try and do a debt retirement capital campaign, have a clear plan for not getting back in the hole before you go and start doing a fundraising initiative. Because any donor, specifically of the baby boomer generation, is going to ask, so how do I know that we're not going to get in this place again? So willingness of donors to provide funding for debt relief is always influenced by the organization's ability to provide in writing a clear, defensible, and believable plan. Put it bluntly, you can't really fill a current debt hole if it's thought that you'll go into another financial hole. Nonprofits cannot go into debt relief well again. So once you have asked a person to give to a fundraising initiative to forgive debt, you can't go back to those folks again. So on the Episcopal Church Foundation's website, we do have resources for capital campaigns. And this is a link that you can click on to go there. It's also got a how to prepare for a capital campaign brochure, a follow me brochure, which is a brief guide to capital campaigns, some sample client materials, including, I believe there's a parish on there that Terry Mathis, one of our consultants, worked with out of Chicago that had a very successful debt retirement capital campaign, as well as a client list and related reading. I can tell you that we have had clients that have been successful with debt retirement. What it takes is it takes external support, it takes a clear plan, and most importantly, it takes a vision that's exciting and a mission where God is calling you all to this effort. Are there any questions before I move into resources, additional resources? While you're typing them in, let me also recommend this book, A Great Day to Fundraise by Tony Paderas and Joyce Braun Paderas. Some of the information we talked about tonight came from that book. If you have any questions or you want some one-on-one conversation, perhaps with a consultant or one of our staff members at the Episcopal Church Foundation, here is our contact information. Terry Mathis or Louise Baeto would be happy to talk to you about either debt retirement or a potential capital campaign. So while I wait for additional questions,
we have, for any of you who wrote to fill in the blank, if I had known we were in this much debt, I would have. I saw Jill wrote, I would have spoken up.
Oh, that's what that meant.
Sorry, I know. Early on.
Yes, absolutely. Many people say they would have spoken up. Oftentimes we don't realize the impact that debt will have on our mission in life until we're already in it, which is why that plan for once we're out of debt is so important, because after living through it and feeling the relief of it, we don't want to go back there again. Wonderful. Well, if there are any questions, I will stay on the line. If not, I want to thank you all for joining this evening. Know that we will remain a resource for you. Feel free to recommend this webinar to others in your parish or other parish partners that you are speaking with. And I wish you many blessings on your mission and ministry, especially this season. So thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. And yes, still, I look forward to meeting you too in just a few weeks. All right. Should I close with a joke? Can I close with a joke?
Oh, please do.
All right. So I just heard this joke today. It was in France, and there was a baker, and the baker was seeing that every day a gentleman came in and took 3 pastries and would eat 3 pastries. And he began to worry about this gentleman's health. And so one day he had a confrontation and said, I'm noticing you're eating 3 pastries. Why? And the gentleman said, oh, well, my brothers, I have 2 brothers, and they're scattered around the world, and we have said that in order to remember one another, we would eat pastries for one another every day as a way to reconnect. And the baker was so moved by this and thought, oh, he's remembering his brother, how sweet. Well, time went on, and after a year, the man came up and said, oh, I only need two pastries today. And the baker became heartbroken, thinking, oh, no, I'm so sorry. And so he didn't say anything the first time, but the second time when the man approached and asked for two pastries, the baker said, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't believe one of your brothers has died. I really regret this. And the pastry eater blinked and said, oh, no, I haven't lost a brother. And the baker said, but you're only eating two pastries. And the man says, yes, but it is Lent, and I have given up pastries. Da, 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 da.
Oh, I get it. It was a delay.
He was eating his brother's pastries.
I like it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. You will be sent an evaluation. We'd love for you to fill that out and let us know how we can improve our offerings. You will also be receiving a link to the recording of this if you want to share it with other colleagues at church, or if you want to fast forward or zoom through something that you missed or wanted to take another look at. You'll have the slides. Vincente, sorry about no slides, but you'll get them in an email. And George, next time I swear we'll figure out your audio, but perhaps the recording will be better too. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye.